Welcome to The Jungle, where we discuss social science and applications to business and society. My name is Doug Lepisto, and I am co-founder of Sleeping Giant Capital and the Center for Principled Leadership and Business Strategy at Western Michigan University. Today, my guest is Dr. Spencer Harrison, who is a professor of Organizational Behaviour at INSEAD. He's a world expert on creativity, coordination, and connection in organizations. We discuss his recent research on creativity and best practices for unlocking it in organizations. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
On here, but that's okay.
Yeah. Well, so thank you for doing this. And I thought this would be fun to we haven't obviously caught up in a while, but do a podcast and learn from you as a world's expert in creativity. I mean, that is who you are. Am I describing you? Because you have an eclectic research interest. It's both creativity, but your work and research has insight into coordination and relationships, and relationships between people, relationships with their organizations. So how would you describe your research now?
I mean, I think one way of looking at it is sort of creativity plus. So typically I'm looking for contexts where people are making something or thinking about something in different ways. And then I'm really interested in what is it that allows people to do that. So sometimes we've actually grown to calling it creative work, because the definition of creativity itself is that you're generating novel or useful ideas, but often there are people that aren't involved in the generation of those ideas per se, but still do a lot of support work, advising, evaluating, that helps those ideas get off the ground as well. So it's sort of trying to broaden that understanding of this notion that creativity is not about geniuses alone in a cabin somewhere solving mathematical formulas, but it's usually people in a context surrounded by individuals that are either trying to help them or maybe trying to disrupt them in some ways. And how is it that people are sort of able to sustain that effort at trying to generate ideas in these social circumstances?
And so is the dependent variable for you is typically what? So the outcome that you want to explain, is it at an idea level? Is it at a group a process? Is it at a product level? What does that look like?
I think more and more the outcome that I'm most interested in is one of two things. So number one is, can I repeat this cycle? So it has something to do with, can I sustain creation? So it's almost thinking about if that outcome is a product. So it might be a film, it might be a music album, it might be a scientific discovery, it might be a really cool t-shirt design. What's interesting for me is that that output then becomes the input to the next cycle of creative work. And so how do the consequences for having come up with this one idea mesh into the consequences of trying to come up with the next idea? And I think what's exciting about that is psychologists have been studying creativity for 70 years. I mean, even longer than that. Some of the, first studies of modern day psychology were studies of what we were calling genius at the time. And the idea was, here are these people that are creating things that other people aren't creating. So what leads them to do that? And clearly at that time, the focus was on, there are individuals that are unique, we'll call them geniuses. And in some ways, that's sort of like the founding of psychology. So people have been doing this for a really long time. And I think what happened was we began to get really, really precise around people are generating ideas and what is the causality. So we began to move toward laboratory settings. And what that does is it gives you hyper precision. And what it doesn't do is it doesn't allow you to understand what are the consequences of people generating those ideas in that laboratory. So when you put people into a classic psychology experiment, those people have no history walking in because you're trying to control that out. And they have no expertise around the creative process itself because, again, you're trying to control that away. And whatever they produce in the laboratory has no material outcome on them going forward and they're likely never going to meet again and have to work together again. But if you think about, you know, a group of individuals that are making a film at Pixar, so there's consequences for how they work together and then they achieve Toy Story 1. But then there's going to be some percentage of those individuals that are going to work together on Toy Story number 2, or the ones that don't work on Toy Story number 2, maybe they leave Pixar and they go other places, but whatever happened to them at Pixar is going to be something that they carry with them to those other places. It might be network connections. Here's who I know, here's somebody that can help me. It might also be sort of what that process felt like and how I might want to change that going forward. So for me, that's what really becomes interesting is we have a really good understanding of, if you take people that have never been creative before and ask them to do a different set of tasks, what might motivate them more than another? What sort of processes can we sort of teach them in a really quick way that might allow them to generate more ideas? And what we understand less is, in the real world, where working collaboratively to generate a new idea has consequences and risks, what happens after multiple cycles of doing that? So that gets it sort of like the one dependent variable I'm really interested in is, how do you sustain creative work over time? And then I think that also leads into the second one, which I'm becoming more and more fascinated with, which is not, when I produce something, does it win an award? Does it generate a lot of money? Does it dominate the market? I think those things are all really interesting. But I think what's really interesting is, most people don't carry that success with them. What they carry with them is the meaning of the success or the failure. So the meaning of having done something creative, I think, is really interesting because it sort of becomes the umbrella under which we begin to understand all our subsequent efforts and how those either filter into that meaning or they take away from that meaning over time. So I think those are the two things that I'm really excited about right now, trying to understand a little bit more.
So on the first step on that, and so much of your work has research has interaction and coordination kind of as a part of it. And is another way, would another way to kind of think about this might be, you know, you could be taught you could be taught a design thinking framework. Step 1 is this, step 2 is this, step 3 is this. But the actual doing of it and the interactions around the tool and how people are coming together and what they say and what they don't say, those frameworks don't get at all of that, which really is a core driver of what the outcome is, not the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 step I have to follow. Is that another way to say it?
Yeah. I think a fun way of thinking about that might be, if you think about the San Francisco 49ers and their current offense, right? And the common discourse in athletics and coaching circles is, Shanahan's a brilliant coach because he has a great system. So he can take, you have a quarterback, that quarterback gets injured, you just plug in another quarterback, he gets injured, you just plug in another quarterback. Because the system's so good, everybody's going to be successful. So if you think about what design thinking has done for us, is it's basically provided us a really great system and sort of raised the floor. So everybody should be able to perform at a level that 20 years ago, when design thinking was not as widespread, one person that knew that would be able to outperform everybody else just because they sort of had an understanding of what is the process. But now we all understand that process. I think, to your point, what we understand less is, even if you have an amazing system, if you put the wrong group of people together, or they don't engage with that system with the right intention, or even in some cases you need the right coach. And that's also another interesting fact is, especially in sort of, the US and sort of Western economies, we often think that creativity is this thing where you just throw a bunch of people together and they generate things, and it's almost, this complete meritocracy and it's this democratic thing. But in a lot of cases, having somebody that's actually the leader that's sort of guiding the creativity can be extremely powerful. And so, to your point, then, I think we do have a really great understanding of process, and that sort of raised the floor of what creativity looks like. You can think about all the tools that people are generating now with generative AI, and that helps raise the floor as well. Or even some of the really cool tools that people are generating now around digital whiteboards that can be sort of guides for you as you go through the creative process. And then you can post all the things that you're generating with people from all over the world, and you can evaluate them and get scores and all these different things that can make that process really efficient, and you're raising the floor. That doesn't necessarily mean that, like, we're increasing the peak, if we don't understand how people are interacting with each other.
So really interesting. And another reason why I love just doing this podcast is I get to, go back to having these kinds of conversations because it's so organizational, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really is not just about individuals or social groups, but it's about systems and rules and organizing structures that because it's goal achievement kind of activity.
Yep.
um so you've done research on feedback, you've done research on coordination and how groups work with ideas over time. um and you mentioned leadership. So if I'm a leader and I say to myself, I'd like to generate more creative output in my organization, there are all these great frameworks, design thinking frameworks or consultants I could use to help me implement a system, to your point.
Mm-hmm.
What is a leader, and but it's missing all of these other pieces on the core, the interactions and the relationship building and the feelings that get made about, in that whole process. What is your what are some of your starting pieces of advice for leaders who want to be better at managing that coordination in creative work?
Yeah. So I think the first part is realizing that creative work is really fragile. And that makes sense. So, if you've been a gardener, you know that when you are putting saplings into the ground or seedlings into the ground, those are very delicate plants at that point, and that's a very delicate moment. So you have to have the soil just right. And the same thing is true when you're beginning to work with a team and you're beginning to sort of establish a norm around how to generate ideas and how to evaluate those ideas. Those ideas are just like those seedlings at that point. And the group context that you're creating is the soil. And so if you haven't created a system where there's an opportunity for those seedlings to at least get into the ground and begin to grow a little bit so you can see what the plant looks like, and you're just sort of killing it as soon as it begins to sprout, then you're really going to struggle as a leader of creative groups. And what that means then is there needs to be a little bit of leniency um, for failure and experimentation, which gets us to all the psychological safety literature that's really exciting right now, and there's a lot of effort going into studying that. But on top of that, it also really requires a connection to the meaning that comes out of those experiences, because if I generate an idea, we begin to work on it, we build a prototype, and then we realize this is not really where the idea is going to go. So at that moment, the team might walk away from that experience and think, we failed. And so the meaning we take away from us is this sort of tainted experience of, as a group, we don't do good things together, we don't know how to coordinate. Or the meaning could be, that was really exciting and it was amazing to move through that process together. I trust Doug now more as a result, and I trust my other colleagues to be able to help me in the difficult moments and to provide valuable feedback. And now that I have those sets of relationships intact and I have this positive meaning, I'm willing to go try it again, and I feel like I can be successful, or at the very least, like, even if I'm not successful, I feel like the outcome of that can still be this enriched meaning that I have from it. And I think one of the other things that this sort of points to as leaders is that organizations, almost by default, but in part due to any sort of business education you might have had, both formal and informal, they teach us to really focus on rationality, bottom line thinking, feasibility. And what we often don't realize when we're thinking, oh, I want to do something that's disruptive, we need to do something creative, we need to fix this process, we need to enter into this new market. At that moment, you don't need feasibility. What you need is novelty. You need to be thinking different. And so you can't apply that same style of thinking at the beginning of the creative process, because all that's going to do is kill all these seedlings. Nothing, when it's sort of germinating as a new idea, is going to really feel feasible unless it's something that you've already seen before. And then by default, that means you're doing something that isn't creative. And so you've either killed the creative process because you've killed all the ideas, or you've killed the creative process because you've sort of sabotaged it and pretended like you're doing creativity, but all you're doing is what you were already doing before you were being creative itself. So I think those are sort of mindset shifts that we have to make as leaders, is to realize it's not about feasibility, it's about novelty. And it's not about finality, it's about nurturing something, which means I need to understand that the idea itself is delicate, but so are the relationships around it and the group setting, and that's sort of the soil that I need to work on as a leader to allow these things to grow.
So you've got a really fragile idea meeting construction and the kind of the boundaries of novelty that early on for leaders. You've studied this, you do creative work. How do you lead creative work? Like, what do you say or do differently as a result of the research that you've done?
So there are actually a number of things that I do differently as a scientist. And I do think, to your point, I think, science is a rigorous process to try to get to some knowledge or some set of social facts that have an evidence base behind them. But to your point, there is a lot of discovery that goes on in that makes it creative. And if we go back to 100 years ago when we were studying creativity, the idea was people struggle with this, and then all of a sudden there is this moment of insight, and then everything crystallizes and you move forward. And what I found is it's not really one moment of insight, it's sort of a continual effort to stay within the ambiguity of novelty, and then every once in a while you pop up and sort of check in with others to see if you've got something, and then you dive back down. And sort of like somebody that would be diving in the ocean, right? That means you're going to hold your breath, that means there's going to be some pressure, that means it might feel a little bit uncomfortable. And maybe if you go down deep enough, you're going to see a beautiful fish, or you're going to see some new coral or something like that. And so it's that choice to keep diving and then keep coming up that I think is really difficult. So one of the things that I do a lot as a scientist is I make sure that I'm trying to tune into my emotions and the emotions in the rest of the group. And I'm not saying that I'm especially good at that, but I think that there are sort of indicators that you encounter as you go through the process that let you know that people's emotional energy might be waning. So, for example, it could be you are on meeting 5 and you're talking about some model that you're developing, you're talking about some piece of data that you gathered, and you realize we just keep talking about it the same way. Our idea around this has not evolved at all. We're just having a circular conversation. And so that's a moment where we need to say, okay, let's dive back down and see what's going on. So one of the practices that I use in that case, and again, this is informed by science, is this practice of let's ask a better question. So we'll take whatever was the question we thought that we were solving, and then we'll challenge everybody on the research team to ask new versions of that question. And we'll usually give ourselves some sort of crazy number to get to, right? So it might be, if we're on a team of 2, everybody has to come up with 21 new questions. Why 21? Like, there's no magic there. It's just that, like, that number is going to push us beyond, 3 questions, and 3 questions would be easy to come up with. But it's when you get to question number 17 and you think, question number 16 was, how do you sustain creativity? So question number 17 is, how do you sustain creativity over 10 years? And then question 18 is, how do you sustain creativity over an entire career? And all of a sudden you realize that how do you sustain creativity is a really great question. But if you're thinking about over the entire career, now you've already all of a sudden specified a time horizon that might really get you into something interesting, because maybe people haven't looked at it that way before. And now that gives you another way of looking at your data and seeing if there's something that it says that's unique in that direction. So that's one of the things that we do to sort of dive back down into this search for novelty is we say, can we ask ourselves a different question? Einstein said if you gave him an hour to solve a problem and his life depended on it, he would spend the first 55 minutes trying to find the right question. And the way that I think about that is sort of if you dropped somebody in the desert and you only gave them a compass and you said, you need to get yourself out of here on your own, you wouldn't, as the person that's stranded, just look at your compass and just say, well, I'm just going to take the first heading and go. You would actually look around at the landmarks, you would look at the compass heading, you would ask yourself, like, which of these directions seems to offer the highest likelihood of me being successful? And I think that that's the same sort of thing that we need to do when we're being creative, is that usually we're starting with some sort of a question, but that might not be the best question, or it might be a question that somebody else handed off to us. It could be a client, it could be, a senior leader that's saying, I want you in charge of this. So very often it's good to say, all right, I understand that's the general direction that they want to go, but is there sort of a slightly different version of that direction that's actually more energizing, that gets us somewhere that's new, that gives us an insight that we haven't thought about before? And so having processes like this that allow you to understand when I'm stalling in the process or when the group is stalling in the process, what can I do that takes us back a step, but actually doesn't feel like we're regressing? It feels like we're pushing us forward.
When
And so that's one of the practices that I like to use.
you mentioned, it was, we think about, leading groups through this creative work, you mentioned the ambiguity, and
Yeah.
as a, yeah, putting, especially I feel like in academic work, scholarly work, you can, in certainly qualitative academic work, you can really be in total ambiguity, in the sense that the very structure of your argument or the terms you are using or the phenomenon you're describing is morphing. And
Yes.
so and you even know the question you're answering. So
Yes.
it is high ambiguity in some ways. It may be an extreme case, right? And that's really uncomfortable for people, is that feeling. And you can see it also with in still vivid instances of, take your young professional who has been kind of business trained or STEM trained, and then you put them into a context that involves some of this creativity, which involves the ambiguity, and they're paralyzed from it, or they're scared of it.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see that in creative work frequently, and how do you see leaders being able to be effective at moving, enable, kind of building that momentum and that motivation to continue through that fog?
Yeah. Um, I think describing this fog is a really good way of thinking about it. Sometimes I think about it as it's a multilinear algebra problem. So the point is I have multiple variables that I haven't been able to solve for, and as a result, every time I try to solve for one, that's going to shift the other ones a little bit, and so I have to sort of figure out how do I solve these things in multiple ways, which requires me to have to come up with different solutions and then sort of begin to compare those solutions with each other and then continue to test those sorts of things. So like in a generic level, I think that that's sort of what's going on. Um, what I think is interesting is so a couple of years ago, when I was at Boston College still, I taught this course that was called Can Creativity Save the World? And it's the favorite course that I ever designed. So we actually said, listen, if we're going to design this, we need to use the design thinking process. We've got to interview people. We've got to gather all these notes. We, had a big post-it board. We went through the entire process and we created this course design that we thought was amazing. And one of the cool quirks about the course was we decided there is some factual knowledge that you need to know about creativity, but the important part is in the doing of creativity. So how can we design the class where they get the facts really quickly and we can test them on that declarative knowledge, but then they spend the rest of the time just practicing and doing. So the thinking was most classes are going to have a midterm and a final. And you know that students' brains are occupied by my 5 courses midterms are all happening within a week. And if you remember your experience as a student, you know that when I'm studying for one, I'm sort of cramming as much knowledge into my brain as I can. And then I take the test and then I shove all that knowledge out and then I cram all the knowledge in for the next one. So our thinking was, what if we created a final for the course in week 3? When they don't have any midterms yet, they don't have any big assignments, so we can occupy all of their brain space and really get these concepts settled. And what we did that was fun is we gave all of the students sources, publicly available, really great source material about creativity itself, and really basic things like the Wikipedia entry on creativity or the Stanford Design School. Here's their definition of the design process. So, like basic publicly available things. And then we let them ask each other questions, and then those questions became the questions for the test. So, every student in the class had access to the entire database of the questions, and then the test they got was randomly pulling a set of questions from that, and they had to know all the answers. What was super interesting about that test is not only was it amazingly hard, and that was great for us as professors because the students had sort of done it to themselves. But what was really interesting is we asked the students, what about creativity? Now that you know all of these basics about it, what about creativity is the most exciting for you? And the answer was repeatedly this notion of incubation. The idea that I might work really hard on an idea, and then I step away from that, and the idea is just sort of percolating in the back of my mind, and then all of a sudden something magical happens, and the idea just fully forms. And the more I talked to the students, the more I realized they were thinking about creativity as this sort of get out of jail free card. Like if I can just learn what the process is, then I actually don't have to work hard. These ideas just come to me, and then I'm able to be successful. And that led to the reason why I think the class was an amazing struggle for the students, because in the next 12 weeks, all they did was practice every 3 weeks, generating a new idea and presenting it. And we would bring in, successful entrepreneurs. We would bring in people that were working in nonprofits. And it was sort of like a Den of Dragons or a Shark Tank scenario. Not exactly, because the panel wasn't there to harass them, and it wasn't filmed, and it wasn't meant to like be high stakes like that. It was actually meant to be like very psychologically safe. But what they found was each one of these 3 weeks was just exhausting. And very often at the time when you had to go present to this panel, you didn't have that breakthrough. You were still sort of in the middle of things, and it was a struggle. And I think that that's one of the other things that's really interesting about creativity is our understanding of creativity is really built up often on these sets of myths, even in some of the research. So this idea of incubation still sort of looms large in people's minds. And it's really compelling to people that are novices and starting out because they think that's actually this sort of, steroid. It's this get out of jail free card that allows me to skip a step and now I'm ahead. And then when you actually do it, you realize, oh, no, this is a lot of effort. Like coming up with ideas, realizing they don't work, having to go back, coming up with ideas again. And that pivot, that continual sort of going back, that diving back down again is so hard and so exhausting for people. And again, that's where leaders become really important because as leaders, you often have to attend to, okay, here's a moment where we need to shift gears, either because we're sort of slamming into a wall or we're just drained of energy or both. But we need to go back in a way that makes us feel like we're going forward, and creating the architecture for that is really tricky.
So that's perfect, because I would clarify then what I said about the challenge of creativity is not only in terms of the process, is the tolerance of the ambiguity.
Yep.
It's the tolerance of the ambiguity with time pressure.
Yes.
Like that it's not like I just sit and I wait. I'm in the fog, and the paper deadline is coming, the tenure deadline is coming, the project deadline's coming, and it's got to be there or it's not. And so there's a pressure to get out of the ambiguity, but and so what then as a leader do you say? What do you say, or what ritual do you do, or what practice do you do to help people deal with that, both the fear and the exhaustion?
Yeah. I think one of the things that we're realizing is that there are different approaches that leaders can take. And that's not going to be earth shattering to anybody. Like, clearly, leaders come in different types. But I think one of the things that's becoming more and more interesting is very often we focused on situations where the leader is merely there to facilitate the group's creativity and sort of help move them through different stages in the process. So you might call that more of a facilitative style. But then we know that you have leaders where the reason why they're embarking on the creative process is because they have a creative idea and they want to see that idea realized. And so what you're doing in that case is you're directing the rest of the group to help you achieve your vision. So you can think of, a director in movies, and very often the director has written the script or they've worked with the screenwriter. They have a very clear idea of what it is they're trying to accomplish. And then the idea is, how can I coordinate these people to make sure that I'm getting to that accomplishment? And what's interesting about that, which sort of gets at your point here, is that there is this interesting tension. So people prefer working with leaders that are more facilitative because that means I have a bigger imprint on what it is that's being created. So we actually did this study with modern dance teams, and we watched the entire creative process over weeks. We videotaped every one of their rehearsals. We interviewed every one of the dancers. And at the end of it, we brought them together and we showed them a video of their final performance. And we did it where we gave them a stopwatch. And we said, what we want you to do with the stopwatch is just push down the button every time you see something where you feel like you had an influence on the dance. And then just hold it down until that influence stopped, and then let it go, and then push it again. And so if the dance was 10 minutes long, how many of those minutes were you actually having an influence? And so what we saw is there were some groups where people just held down the timer the entire time. Like, everybody felt like they had this huge influence on what was going on. And there were other groups where people rarely held down the timer. It was just sort of, oh, there's a movement, my hand went up, that was my idea, but then I turned it right off because then I'm back into this movement that the choreographer actually created. So here's what's interesting. In those two different groups, the ones where people are holding down the button the entire time and the one where they're holding down short, when you're holding down the button the entire time and you have a leader that's sort of facilitating you bringing your ideas in, you feel an enormous amount of satisfaction during the process. And yet when I privately ask you to rate the quality of the dance, you rate it as lower quality. And the flip side is true in the direction case. So I don't have as much satisfaction in the process. I didn't get to engage as much, but I recognize that the quality is higher and the pieces of the creative work actually fit together in a meaningful way. So when I walk out of it, that's something where I can say, oh, that's actually part of my portfolio. That's something that I was really proud to be a part of. Whereas the other one, it felt really good, but I'm probably not going to point people to it in the future because, like, it's not something that I feel like really demonstrates my skills very well. So I think one of the things then that points to is, as leaders, we need to be really clear around, what is my role? Is my role to facilitate the creative work? Which means, yes, I need to generate ideas and get people involved, but that's the part where people are going to feel really good about it. So the difficult thing for a facilitator is, how do I get these ideas to fit together in a way so that people can actually see the final product as being really high quality? So it's going to be easy to get the satisfaction. It's going to be harder to get the quality. And the direction, you have the opposite problem. People might not feel as satisfied with the process, but they're really going to like the output, assuming that you're not just a jerk. And then that introduces like another set of problems that we've actually been researching lately as well.
So is this a shout out to Bess Rouse? Is this back from that, or is this something else?
So the direction facilitation stuff is 100% the research that Bess and I were doing when we were in Boston together. 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Huge shout out to Bess
but but
Rouse.
but the timer thing. I didn't know you guys did this timer thing.
So we did it three different ways. We actually
Did you
asked them
publish this?
before.
Did you publish this?
We don't have the timer part. We didn't actually use the data.
Yeah.
Um, we published a slice of the data. So we actually asked people on a survey how involved they thought they were. And then we thought, well, there's retrospective bias there. So let's give them timers. And so I bought all of these stopwatches and we literally had them give us timers and then they reported the amount of time. And so we have all of that in a spreadsheet. And then we also worried, well, maybe that's not good enough. And so we gave them sheets of paper that had timestamps on it and highlighters. And we just had them highlight sections of the dance in this sort of timeline that indicated moments where they had an influence. So we had three different ways of measuring it, and the correlation among them was like in the high 0.8 or low 0.9. I mean, it was incredible how well that all triangulated. So
Hmm.
yeah, we didn't end up publishing like all those different methods to show that, but that was this moment where Bess and I looked at each other and we thought that we were sort of, psychologists from the 60s where we had these stopwatches and people are
Yeah.
recording these little timestamps. Yeah.
No, so you're facilitating and directive. I mean, this is something I've experienced just in trying to create things and found things and work with people on doing this is the expectation setting is huge. That
Hmm.
going in what you're going to feel and see and the challenge of it, and it's framed that way, and that's a good thing. That's an okay thing. That's a positive thing, and so you're setting that expectation. And then another piece of this is, and maybe it's just my style, but it is so much of bringing in the energy to a group to keep them going. So you're
Yes.
facilitating, directing, expectation setting, and just inspiring, motivating, which as a leader can be exhausting
Yes.
because you are constantly trying to be the wind at the sails when people are having a hard time.
Yeah.
A lot of management just personally you have to do to be able to be effective at that, in what I've experienced doing some of this.
I would agree with that completely. And I think that, everything that we've talked about relates to the founding experience of an organization, and that fog of ambiguity and the tolerance for it is there. And you're not the only one experiencing that as a leader, everybody else is. So you need to shoulder that in a different way, right? And one way of shouldering it is, how am I going to facilitate these people to work together? And as another shout out to Bess Rouse, she has amazing research on how founders identify with their organizations, and sort of getting at this facilitation versus direction perspective. What her research shows is that some founders are more likely to identify with the people. And so it's all about, can I create a people system that feels sustaining? And other founders are going to be more focused on the idea, which is probably a little bit more of a directive focus. Like, how can I make this idea, this product amazing? And then I'm going to move on to the next idea or the next product. But you can even see a lot of organizations might start off with sort of a facilitative group or a founder that's more facilitative, and that sort of gets the group moving in a certain direction. And they can get funding and they begin to grow to a certain size. And at some point, the VCs and the investors will say, we need to get a professional manager in here that's going to be a little bit more directive and sort of really push us toward the idea and toward the market. And so sometimes you have to alternate between people that are leading, because you need these different styles at different points in time in a project as well.
So let's talk about your recent ASQ,
Okay.
and that's a administrative science quarterly, which is I think it's still the most prestigious journal we have. I don't know if it is, but it's just because of the kind of scope and creativity and rigor that you need to publish an ASQ is world class. So congratulations. That's
Thank you.
a great feeling. Um, so I've skimmed through this paper, and one thing that's interesting about this work is it's the create back to where we started our conversation. It's what is the cycle of creativity as a group? We've gone through the fog. we've somehow worked this thing successfully. We've dealt with that challenge, and we've created successfully. And it's a great study of new artists and Grammy Award winners and how they receive their subsequent success.
Hmm.
Uh, can you share a little bit about that paper and what you found and what it means for continuing to be able to be creative over time?
Yeah. Um, so I think for me, what was exciting about this paper was number one, it was just fun to work with the data. As somebody that really likes music, um, and that grew up in the 80s, it was sort of an excuse to just get to dive into that and understand some of these bands a little bit more and understand what was going on sort of behind the scenes. So at one level, you could think of this as the scientific equivalent of VH1 Behind the Music. And what I think about, if you've ever watched VH1 Behind the Music, you almost always get to this moment where the narrator says, and then everything came crashing down. And then there's a pause for the advertisements, and you come back and the band has hit rock bottom, and you wonder, what are they going to do going forward? And what was interesting about this study is we gathered everybody that was nominated for or won a Grammy for Best New Artist from 1980 to 1990. So we have roughly 55 different groups that are involved in this study. And then we gathered all of the publicly available interviews anybody in that band ever gave, and then put them together to create an oral history of what was it like to actually be in this band. And what became really apparent early was that some of the bands had an oral history that might have spanned 4 years, and other bands had an oral history that would span almost 40 years. So there was clearly a difference in duration in terms of, can these people actually stand being in a room together to make music with each other? And you hear all of these different metaphors. Probably the most common one is, well, being in a band is like a marriage, and sometimes you end up really hating each other and you get divorced or you got married too early. So there is all this rhetoric around that. And what's interesting about that is the notion that, the work that we're doing is not just about producing a product, but it evokes these deep human emotions and these really deep senses of connection to each other. And so part of the question is not just, can we sustain the work, but can we sustain the connections that allow us to sustain the work? And you would think, if one of the very first things you produce is legitimated by your industry as, this is one of the best things we've ever heard this year, that you have just been given a springboard to success for the rest of your career. Like, you've been given a lot of freedom to fail because everybody's gonna wait for you to do the next best thing. And what we found is the bands at that moment tended to ask themselves a question, and they phrased it in different ways, but the question was basically, is this who we want to be? And a lot of people are so caught up in that energy of the recognition that they're getting at this super high level, that it inflates their sense of what it means to be recognized for the work they're doing. And the answer they give to that question is, yes, this is what we want. And as a result, then it begins to twist their understanding of the creative process that they're just really beginning to understand, because they've only gone through it a couple times. They're a young band, but it begins to get wrenched into this idea of, it's not enough to just produce an album that we like. It has to be something that all of these fans want, all of the critics like, and it's going to get legitimated and be a massive success again. And the ironic thing then is, in trying to replicate what they've done in the past, they actually ruin their ability to do exactly what it is they want. Because now they're focused on, will my fans still like this music? And as a result, they feel constrained to matching the sound that they had in the past. And then in the end, they end up resenting their fans for not liking the new things that they have. And so then they have all this negative meaning associated with the songs that they've produced. And finally, they get to this point where they burn out and they break up and they resent each other as a result. And so there is this really tight relationship between the process that we go through, what we end up producing, and how we feel about that thing, that just becomes immensely corrupted for these groups. And then the other set of groups, and this is a much smaller set of the entire 55, it's about 13 of those. They ask that same question, is this what we really wanted? And their answer is different. The answer is no. It's nice that we have the recognition. We're not saying that we want to put that back in the bottle, but our focus was always, can we make good music together? And so as a result, they do some really weird things. They fire their managers. They leave their record label. They found their own record label. They begin to insulate themselves from all of these different pressures that the other bands have said yes to, so that they can just focus on each other and what does it mean to be in this group. Now, at first blush, you would think from the creativity literature, like this is the death knell of their ability to be creative because you need to have new connections and that's what brings new ideas. But very often the research that looks at like how new network connections emerge tends to neglect is that when you've been massively successful, the people that are trying to connect with you now want something from you. And usually what they want is they want a bit of that success as well. And so as a result, like their impulse is going to be just do what you did in the past instead of, yeah, like you have freedom. Let me facilitate. Let me help you come up with something new. So what happens is this small subset, they dramatically outperform the rest of them. They stay together on average for 8 years longer. Their next album charts on average 20 points higher on the Billboard Hot 100. Their music, and this was the measure that I liked the most, their music tends to be covered by other musicians more often than the other artists. So it means that your music doesn't just resonate for you as a band. You're actually creating things that other musicians are like, I want to add this to my repertoire because it resonates. It's saying something that's important. And as a result, you have this immense set of gratitude for all of your success early on and for what these songs mean. You can actually listen to your back catalog and you can really enjoy it. And when we finally got to that point, it actually reminded me. So when I was an undergraduate at the University of Utah, there was this concert series that they had that was called Mayfest. And one of the years that I went to it, Modern English came and played. And Modern English has this very famous song that's called Melt With You. So, it's this great little setting. There's this, this group of people. Modern English is playing. They play their very first song. And some joker that's right at the front of the stage, he yells out, play Melt With You, play Melt With You. And the lead singer looks at him and he says, play Melt With You in this very demeaning, sarcastic tone. And he says, why don't you just F off? And I thought, oh no, now they're not going to play Melt With You. But you could see how like they were tortured by their relationship with this song. Like that had gone from being this award, this like wonderful thing they could point to an albatross around their neck, simply because of what that had done to the creative process and how that had changed their ability to work with each other. And this is why I think creativity is sort of endlessly fascinating, because you might strike gold once, but whether or not you can do that again depends immensely on what did you take from that process and what choices are you making going forward. And it's so easy for the thing that you want to pervert the process and make it into you getting exactly the opposite of what you were trying to achieve. So again, the irony here is the bands that were saying, no, that's not what we want, by saying no, they actually ended up getting more success, more acclaim, more nominations for awards in the future, because that's exactly what they weren't looking for.
Mm. Yeah, I was listening to a few interviews with Rick Rubin in his book on creativity, or is it The Creative Act? Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
But
Yep.
his note, what you're speaking, what I heard and what you said is that this kind of orientation towards art, and you do it for and meaning you do it almost for yourself or yourselves in this case. You do it how you want to do it, how you would like to do it, rather than imagining the wishes or desires or perceptions of an audience.
Yeah.
And that there's something really intrinsically, it's a really interesting way of being if you make it for yourself and be okay with that you do it how you like to do it. And if other people like it, great. And if they interpret it some way, great. And if they don't, that's okay. It's art.
Yep. Yep. But I think even then, if you think about that from a business perspective, so you might say, listen, as a founder, you need to be hyper focused on the market and what does the market want? And there is truth to that. But in one of the studies that we were looking at how entrepreneurs get feedback on their early ventures. And I remember as we were sitting in and listening to the entrepreneur's pitch and then the feedback they were getting, and then when we were interviewing them, I felt like I was in Las Vegas at a Gamblers Anonymous meeting because so many of them were less focused on the idea and they were more focused on the outcome. Like, I'm just doing this because I want a really great exit. I want to make a lot of money. And I'm not saying that you can't be money motivated, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't get some big incentive for creating something new that provides value to people. What I am saying is, at one point, when it's late at night and you need to work for another 2 hours and you need to motivate a team of people to keep pushing on things, it's not going to be enough for money to motivate people to want to do that. At some point, they need to want to do it because they enjoy working with each other and because they are proud of the product that they're making. And when you have those ingredients, even if one of the albums doesn't work out or one of your pitches as a fledgling business doesn't work out, like, you can pivot to the next one and you can learn from each other and you can keep going forward and improve your understanding of the process. But if you're just doing it for the outcome and you don't get that outcome immediately, it's very easy to let that go. And I think just as like one point of pontification, there's this other stream of research that we're working on right now, and it's beginning to go through the review process, but it actually looks at how our early childhood experiences with trying to be creative often face negative feedback, and we internalize that, and as a result, we're afraid of being creative again in the future. And I think you see some of that in how people approach these sorts of things. So we might start with a creative idea, but then we remember, oh, in the past that creative idea was shut down, a teacher ripped up our drawing, somebody pointed us and they laughed. And so we're only going to try once, and if it doesn't work out, like, I'm done, because what I've learned is it's painful to keep trying that. And again, I think that this points to the reason why we need leaders that are more thoughtful about creativity, because they're actually creating the conditions that tell people, no, you're not good enough, and then they carry that meaning with them. Or they're creating conditions that say, you can do this, even if you didn't do it in the past, you can do this and we can do this together. And that's what people carry forward. And in a world that's facing all these crises, whether they're economic, whether they're climate related, whether they're about, how we relate to each other through our politics or a social class system, just to quote Einstein again, right? We can't solve our problems with the same level of thinking that produced them. So we need creativity more than ever. And that requires us as leaders, as educators, as founders of organizations to create the conditions that allow people to feel that sense of, I can do this and we can do this together. Because that's basically what the world needs in order for us to continue thriving on this planet.
Let's stop there. We've covered everything from ambiguity to emotion to identity to attachment to boundaries to failure to fear, and back again. In some ways, it's a miracle that we actually can achieve it. Versus back to your point around that versus a genius who has the insight. There's so much work and so much expertise that it takes. Great to see you. We'll need to catch up again at a meeting here. I think we'll be at AOM here next year, so hopefully we can catch up again. But thanks for taking the time. I mean, it's so much fun to just learn from and hear your research again and how it's evolved and blossomed and flourished, and just super cool. So great to chat.
My pleasure, Doug. Anytime.